So much happening in Alberta's legislature this week, between the premier introducing a motion to hold a referendum this fall to environmental issues. And then, of course, there's that infamous Sky Palace dinner he held on the rooftop. Here to discuss it all is our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, welcome back to this show. So great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So Jason Kenney has said, of course, he's sorry for the Sky Palace dinner that he held where it appeared that he wasn't social distancing. And he got a lot of pressure from within his own caucus, didn't he? Tyler, were you present for this apology as he has now come out and apologized? Did you hear it? I'm thinking the opposition isn't buying it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the press conference, the video where he's sort of expressed some contrition. It's sort of a classic scenario in politics. Where an apology 5 days ago or 6 days ago, whatever it is, really would have sort of nipped this in the bud, I think. But Kenny sort of, stood firm for several days until, as you say, he started getting criticism, not just from caucus members, which of course we've seen several times over the past year or so, but from cabinet ministers as well, saying that they think he goofed and should issue an apology. And as for your other question, no, the New Democrats are not buying it. I have to give the New Democrats a bit of credit because they've come up with this moniker for the people who are there with Kenney, and they're calling them the liquor cabinet in question period, which, whatever else you think of this affair, is a darn good bit of political public relations, I would say.
Yeah, totally. Has it come out yet who actually took these pictures or how they were taken?
No, that remains a total mystery. Some of the best guesses that seem to be out there are that this might be a telephoto lens from an apartment or condo building sort of across the way. Perhaps someone floated a drone up there to take these photos. Um, I tend to think it's probably a telephoto just because I can't imagine that if you were flying a drone around the legislature grounds, there wouldn't be sheriffs running all over trying to stop you. So, but yeah, one of the still open-ended mysteries of this affair.
It is a mystery. All right, then. Now, Premier Kenney has said that in October we'll be having an equalization referendum. He put forward a motion in the legislature this week. So what came of this motion, Tyler, and what can this actually accomplish?
Yeah, so this is a long-standing promise of the United Conservatives. I think probably all the way back to the election, certainly out of the Fair Deal panel report that came out a year-ish ago, I think, year and a half ago maybe. And what it is this motion goes before the legislature, and they basically determine the language that's going to be used in this referendum. It's going to be a simple yes/no question, something along the lines of should the Alberta government press the Canadian government to remove the equalization formulas from the Constitution? Of course, Alberta can't really just change the Constitution. So what this is, according to Kenney, going to do is gives the Alberta government a little bit of negotiating power. They can then go to the federal government and say, look, we had a referendum on this. X% of Albertans want something done on this. We should sit down and discuss it. Whether or not that will lead to any change is, of course, you get different answers on that depending on who you ask, whether you ask the UCP, whether you ask the opposition. And the New Democrats also sort of pressuring Aaron O'Toole to say something about this, in case he forms the next federal government. And the other thing of note on this is that this referendum will be part of the municipal election. So when you go to vote for your mayor and councillors and school trustees, this referendum question will also be on the ballot.
Okay, interesting. Well, time will tell, I guess, how this turns out. Now, the TransCanada Energy, or TC Energy, has just announced that they are terminating the Keystone XL pipeline project. So, Tyler, what can you tell us about this?
It's the end of an era, isn't it? For the last 10, 11 years, it's been stop and start, on and off, controversy after controversy. Now, when Joe Biden became president, one of his very first executive actions, maybe his first executive action, was to cancel the permit that allowed construction to be built across the border. And that pretty much killed the pipeline. This would have been back in sort of mid-January. Now, sort of 6 months later, we have the TC Energy and the Alberta government both announcing on Wednesday that it's done. The company's going to wind down operations. They're going to lay out a plan for doing it safely and environmentally sound ways. The Alberta government maintaining that it's still going to try and get back the $1.3 billion it's put up for this project. Whether or not that's going to happen, again, very debatable. but certainly a good, whatever happens, likely that a good chunk of tax dollars have just sort of vanished into the ether, unfortunately.
Wow. And of course, speaking of environmental issues, Heather McPherson, Alberta's lone NDP member, our new Democrat member of parliament, is pushing a federal bill that would require a full federal assessment of any new coal mining projects in the Rocky Mountains. So, Tyler, why is this notable?
Well, there's been this long running controversy, I guess, in Alberta over coal mining. We've talked about it a few times on the show that the United Conservatives canceled the 1976 coal policy. There was, major blowback from country music stars, small town mayors. The UCP walked that back. They're now undergoing consultations on the coal policy, including Indigenous consultations. Um, the catch federally is that only coal mines of a certain size, I believe it's 5,000 tons of coal per day. If they reach that threshold, then a coal project needs to go through the whole federal environmental assessment. If they're under that threshold, they don't, and provincial governments can just deal with it. So what McPherson is trying to do is make it so that any of these projects will need to be dealt with by the federal government. Her argument being basically that the Alberta government can't be trusted on this file, can't be trusted to do these assessments properly. So, in many ways, I would say a similar position that the Alberta New Democrats are taking on this issue. So I've talked about it a few times. It just goes to show that this issue of coal really has legs, and it appears now to be spilling over into the federal scene, which is notable for Alberta, and also I think it would be notable for British Columbia because they have such a large coal industry as well.
Definitely. It's an issue that's not going away anytime soon. That is for sure. Now, of course, Canada saw a devastating attack earlier this week. So, in the wake of that attack that killed several members of a Muslim family in London, Ontario, the Alberta Legislature held an emergency debate. So, Tyler, what is Jason Kenney promising?
They've basically promised new legislation that's going to sort of change the way that hate crimes are prosecuted. They also had this sort of anti-racism panel that had reported back, and the contents of that report haven't really yet come out. But they're also engaging with that panel to come up with some other ideas. Now, of course, there was sort of unanimous consent for passing this motion condemning the attacks and expressing solidarity with the Muslim community. The New Democrats also pushing for a couple other things, including better anti-racism education, and an anti-racism sort of secretariat working group sort of thing to be created that didn't quite get the support from the UCP. So that stuff is nebulous in some ways. We haven't seen draft legislation or this report or anything like that, but those promises are now on the record. So we'll be keeping an eye on that.
Absolutely. Now, the Alberta government is recommending that mandatory hotel quarantine be ended. So Health Minister Tyler Shandro has written to the feds asking for it to be ended.
Yeah, so this is that 14-day quarantine. People were calling it, quarantine camps and things like that. Basically, you come back into the country, you need to spend either 3 days in this isolation, and then if you don't have a proper place to go, like whether, for example, if you live in a multi-generational household, you could then stay for 2 weeks. Now, the Federal Advisory Committee saying to scrap this, the Alberta government saying, yes, please scrap it. It'd be great to have some tourists coming in. And actually on Wednesday, there was a little bit of movement on this. And the gist of it basically is the federal government said, look, if you're a Canadian citizen and if you are fully vaccinated, you will no longer need to do this full quarantine. So there's been a little bit of a walking back on those restrictions. Of course, they don't apply to international travelers, so perhaps not a step quite as far as what the Alberta government had asked for. And they've also asked for the return of a pilot program of testing that had been in place at the Calgary International Airport. Unclear whether or not that's going to happen, but perhaps a wise idea considering a month away, Calgary Stampede is supposed to kick off.
Yeah, we are right in the threshold of vacation time and tourism time. So definitely we're going to have to see what happens there. Now, the government announced recently they've given out 3 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines. Does this mean the next stage of reopening should be coming along very shortly?
Yeah, well, on Thursday, the Alberta government's stage 2 kicks off. So that means things like Gyms are going to open again. You can then walk in for a haircut. As you can see, I'm deeply suffering from the pandemic hair situation. So the next round is coming. 3 million doses given in Alberta. They're saying that this is really what's going to make the difference and get everyone out of the pandemic. So it's good news no matter how you look at it. The federal government, I should say, also announcing something like 7 million doses of Moderna coming over the next month or so. So we are going to be flooded with vaccines in the next little while, and hopefully that will really mean that the Alberta government sticks its reopening plan. They're sort of planning on early July for things to be back to normal. There hasn't been much talk about moving that up, but I guess we'll have to see how the vaccination schedules go.
So now, in a speech, Rachel Notley has declared that were her party to form government, the election is 2 years off, but they're saying that they would forge ahead with universal daycare with or without the federal government's input.
Yeah, so this actually happened at the New Democrats convention over the weekend, and I have to admit, I'd hardly even noticed it was a convention because, of course, it was all virtual. So you didn't have any of the going for drinks with sources and all that kind of stuff that normally accompanies convention season. But that's exactly what she said. She said, look, we're going to go ahead with universal daycare. Now, if we cast back to sort of the last federal budget, there was money set aside or promised for daycare programs across the country. Now, that was all going to be contingent upon an agreement between provinces and the federal government on cost sharing and things like that. But the New Democrats, of course, saying they're going to do it no matter what. Now, of course, that money is there, so it is likely they will manage to find an agreement if they do form government. And the other thing I should actually note on that front is Rachel Notley also received like 98.6 support from New Democrat members in a vote at the convention. And there was a funny moment in question period on Wednesday when one of the members of the United Conservatives said Notley enjoyed North Korea levels of popularity, and that got a laugh even from her own side of the chamber. So a little bit of levity in the House, which certainly doesn't happen every day.
Yeah, no kidding. And you know what, Tyler, speaking of popularity, an Angus Reid poll just came out that rated all the premiers across the country. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney rating the lowest at, what was it, 31% of Albertans are in favor of him. So that doesn't bode well for him. What do you think is going on?
Well, there's a couple things going on. The first is that, like most new governments, they tried to do a lot of their unpopular stuff in the first couple years. They picked a lot of those big battles in the first couple years, whether that was doctor contract stuff. They tried to tackle some difficult things like rural crime. They picked a fight over supervised consumption sites, things like that. So any government is going to be unpopular sort of halfway through their mandate. That's generally expected. But then, of course, you expect you're going to have 2 years to sort of get your popularity back up. But then they got hit by the pandemic, and the New Democrats, I think, have been very, very effective in opposition, really hammering Jason Kenney every step of the way. It doesn't help that there's been a relatively hostile sort of public health establishment, I think. You obviously people are paying attention to the things Dina Hinshaw says, but you also have university professors, you have doctors who are already mad with the government because of contract stuff. So it's really just been, I think, in many ways a perfect storm for him. He was already in, dire straits over some stuff. The economy obviously hasn't turned around as they'd hoped. There's this massive pandemic that's shut the world down for the past year and a half. Well, not quite that long, but a year at any rate.
Yeah, feels like a year and a half at least.
Yeah, doesn't it? So there's basically just a lot going on for him that I don't think he expected, that has not been particularly easy to handle. But beyond that, it is a bit of a mystery. If you look at British Columbia and Alberta, we've both done relatively similar things, yet John Horgan is not that unpopular. So I admit it's a bit of a head scratcher every once in a while.
Yeah, in fact, I think Horgan came in at number 2 in popularity behind the Quebec premier. So interesting. Okay, well, we have very short amount of time left, but here's one that's been in the media quite a bit. Edmonton pastor James Coates, who's made headlines for his arrest, has partly lost his battle in court. I guess a judge dismissed his challenge that the religious gatherings the restrictions on it were unconstitutional. So what's next in this case?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a complicated setup. So he had to put in an application to have the actions of AHS basically from his December ticket found unconstitutional. And the judge tossed that, basically saying that Coates tried to argue that this was interfering with religious liberty and things like that. And the judge basically said, no, religious people are, sort of subject to the same laws as everyone else. So what the judge didn't do was decide on the constitutionality of the public health orders themselves. So will be coming back to court at the end of June to sort of discuss that further. Now, the political angle in all this, of course, is that Jason Kenney has found himself in hot water over this, even though it's not entirely his fault. Obviously, it is his government that put these public health orders into place. But Grace Life has been a real focal point for protest against the government's lockdown measures. So just a notable development in that case that, of course, has had international attention.
Yeah, most definitely. It looks like we are out of time, though. Tyler, once again, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks for having me.